For thousands of years, they survived where most humans can barely breathe. High in the Himalayas, surrounded by some of the harshest landscapes on Earth, Tibetan civilization endured isolation, empire, invasion, and extreme altitude itself. But where do the Tibetans actually come from? Are they simply descendants of ancient East Asians who climbed into the mountains? Or is the genetic story far more complicated, shaped by mysterious Ice Age survivors, forgotten migrations, and even DNA from an extinct human species? Scientists have been wrestling with this question for decades. And now, ancient DNA is finally giving us answers. Some of them are genuinely surprising. In this video, we're going to trace the genetic story of the Tibetan people. From the first humans who entered the Tibetan plateau after the Ice Age, through ancient Himalayan migrations and the rise of Tibetan civilization, to one of the strangest genetic adaptations ever discovered in humans. Because the Tibetan genetic story isn't just unusual. In many ways, it's unlike any other on Earth. Today, there are roughly 7 to 8 million Tibetans living across the Tibetan Plateau and surrounding Himalayan regions, including parts of modern China, India, Nepal, and Bhutan. Many also live in diaspora communities around the world after the upheavals of the 20th century. But here's what makes Tibet so extraordinary. Geography itself shaped almost everything about their genetics. The Tibetan Plateau is often called the roof of the world. Much of it sits above 4,000 meters, or around 13,000 feet. At that altitude, oxygen levels can drop by nearly 40% compared to sea level. Most people who move there develop headaches, exhaustion, and sometimes life-threatening altitude sickness. But Tibetans don't respond the same way. And that's not incidental. It's the reason their DNA became so unique. For thousands of years, the plateau acted like a natural fortress. Mountains isolated communities from surrounding populations, slowing migration and preserving ancient genetic layers that disappeared elsewhere in Asia. At the same time, Tibet sat at the crossroads between East Asia, Central Asia, and South Asia. So despite its isolation, waves of people still reached it over time. Here's what's interesting. Tibetans also have one of the most famous biological adaptations ever discovered in humans. Their bodies process oxygen differently from almost every other population on Earth. Scientists later discovered that part of this adaptation may have come from an extinct human relative called the Denisovans. And yes, we'll get to that. The Tibetan language belongs to the Sino-Tibetan language family, one of the largest language groups on Earth. That means Tibetan is actually distantly related to Chinese, Burmese, and several Himalayan languages spoken across Asia today. That surprises a lot of people. Because culturally and historically, Tibet often feels completely separate from China. But linguistically, they share ancient roots that likely trace back thousands of years to farming populations living near the Yellow River in northern China. And this is where it gets surprising. Some linguistic researchers believe early Sino-Tibetan languages may have spread alongside millet farming communities during the Neolithic period, long before large states or empires existed in East Asia. Language alone can't tell us everything. People can adopt new languages without major population replacement. But it gives us an important clue about ancient movement into the plateau. But before we get to the DNA, we need to go back much further, to the people who were here first. The earliest humans on the Tibetan plateau probably arrived tens of thousands of years ago, during the late Ice Age. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Nwayar Davu in northern Tibet suggest humans reached parts of the plateau at least 30,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Imagine that for a moment. Ice Age hunters surviving in one of the coldest, highest environments on Earth. We still know surprisingly little about what these first plateau people looked like. But ancient DNA suggests they were related to deeply ancient East Eurasian hunter-gatherer populations spreading across parts of Asia after the last Ice Age. Small bands moved through valleys, hunted wild yak and antelope, and adapted slowly to extreme elevation. Then came the second major wave. Around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, Neolithic farming populations began expanding westward from northern China. These communities cultivated millet and brought more stable settlement patterns into regions surrounding the plateau. Genetic studies show these early farmers mixed with older highland hunter-gatherer groups rather than replacing them entirely. That's important. The Tibetan population wasn't created by one migration. It became a layered population, a genetic mosaic formed over thousands of years. And then came another major transformation during the Bronze Age. Step-related ancestry, connected broadly to Indo-European migrations moving across Eurasia, eventually reached parts of the Himalayan world as well. But unlike Europe, where Yamnaya ancestry became dominant in many regions, Tibet received much smaller amounts. Genetic studies suggest most Tibetans today still derive the majority of their ancestry from ancient East Asian-related populations connected to northern China and early plateau inhabitants. That doesn't mean the steppe had no influence. Trade, technology, and cultural exchange moved across Central Asia for centuries. Some Western Tibetan populations show small but noticeable traces of Western Eurasian ancestry. But the core Tibetan genetic profile remained remarkably stable. And this is where one discovery changed everything. In 2019, scientists studying an ancient jawbone from Baishia Karst cave on the northeastern Tibetan plateau identified Denisovan remains at high altitude. Denisovans were an extinct human species closely related to Neanderthals. For years, scientists wondered why Tibetans carried unusual DNA connected to Denisovans. Now they had a clue. Denisovans may have already adapted to high-altitude life long before modern humans permanently settled the plateau. And some of that genetic adaptation appears to have passed into Tibetan populations through ancient interbreeding. That's not a small detail. It may be one of the clearest examples anywhere on Earth of extinct human DNA directly helping modern humans survive. For centuries, historians debated whether Tibetans were mostly isolated mountain people or descendants of repeated outside invasions. The history books often emphasized conquest, empire, and migration. But when scientists looked at the DNA, they found something different. The Tibetan Empire exploded onto the world stage during the 7th century. At its peak, it rivaled Tang China and controlled huge parts of Central Asia. Armies crossed mountains. Trade routes connected distant peoples. Buddhism spread across the plateau. Many historians assumed this period must have dramatically reshaped Tibetan genetics through mass migration. But genetic evidence suggests remarkable continuity. Studies published in journals like Nature Communications found that despite centuries of political upheaval, the core Tibetan population remained strongly connected to earlier plateau ancestry. Outside influence arrived, yes. But the original population survived and remained dominant. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Researchers at Fudan University and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology discovered that Tibetans form a distinct genetic cluster within East Asia. They are related to nearby Han Chinese populations, but clearly separate as well. Thousands of years of adaptation and relative isolation pushed them down a very different evolutionary path. The history books said Tibet sat at the edge of empires. The DNA suggests Tibet also became a refuge, preserving ancient ancestry that changed less dramatically than many neighboring regions. But survival on the plateau came with another consequence. Isolation. Many Tibetan communities remained separated by mountains and valleys for centuries. That isolation preserved unique genetic adaptations, but it also created strong regional differences inside Tibet itself. Some Western groups show more Central Asian influence. Eastern Tibetans often cluster more closely with neighboring East Asian populations. Highland communities remained especially distinct. And then there's the Denisovan connection. For years, scientists couldn't explain why Tibetans carried a rare version of a gene called EPAS1. This gene helps regulate the body's response to low oxygen. Most humans at high altitude compensate by producing huge numbers of red blood cells, which can actually become dangerous over time because the blood thickens. Tibetans evolved a different solution. Their bodies use oxygen more efficiently without dangerously increasing blood thickness. Researchers later discovered the EPAS1 variant closely matched Denisovan DNA. In other words, Tibetans may survive at extreme altitude partly because their ancestors inherited ancient genetic material from another human species entirely. That's extraordinary. Not metaphorically extraordinary. Literally extraordinary. Very few human populations carry such a clear example of adaptive introgression, meaning useful DNA entering the population from an extinct human lineage. It's one of the most famous discoveries in modern genetics. And despite everything Tibetans endured over the centuries, harsh geography, political conflict, cultural pressure, the core identity of the population persisted. The mountains isolated them. But those same mountains also protected them. So what does Tibetan DNA actually look like today? Modern Tibetans derive most of their ancestry from ancient northern East Asian populations connected to Neolithic communities near the Yellow River, mixed with older plateau hunter-gatherer ancestry that may stretch back to Ice Age settlers. Different studies produce slightly different numbers, but estimates often suggest the majority of Tibetan ancestry comes from these ancient East Asian-related sources. There are also smaller layers. Some Tibetan groups, especially in Western regions, show traces of Central Asian and steppe-related ancestry. Southern Himalayan communities sometimes show limited South Asian admixture as well. But compared to many populations sitting at major crossroads, Tibetans remained genetically distinct to a remarkable degree. The dominant Y chromosome haplogroups among Tibetan men often include haplogroup D and haplogroup O. Haplogroup D is especially interesting because it's rare globally yet appears in Tibet, Japan, and the Andaman Islands. Scientists still debate exactly how these ancient lineages spread across Asia. And this challenges a popular myth. Many people imagine isolated populations as genetically pure. But the Tibetan story shows something more complicated. Tibetans are ancient, yes. Distinct, absolutely. But they were never frozen in time. Their genetics formed through multiple migrations, mixtures, and adaptations layered across thousands of years. And that's the genetic story of the Tibetans as far as science has taken us so far. Research from institutions like the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Fudan University, and the Max Planck Institute continues to develop this picture with new ancient DNA being added regularly. DNA explains origins. But history explains strength. And when you look at the Tibetan story, what stands out isn't just survival at high altitude. It's survival across time itself. Languages changed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Religions spread. Borders shifted. But the people of the plateau endured. Identity is never just about blood. What makes Tibetans unique is not only a shared genome, but a shared relationship with one of the harshest environments humans have ever permanently inhabited. The Tibetan people are living proof that identity is layered, ancient, adaptive, and often surprising. Have you ever taken a DNA test and discovered ancestry you didn't expect? And what do you think about the Denisovan connection? Does knowing extinct human DNA still survives inside modern populations change the way you think about human history? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love ancient history, genetics, and the story of how human populations were formed. And if you want more deep dives into the origins of peoples from around the world, make sure to subscribe. We've got many more genetic mysteries coming next. Share this video with someone who has Tibetan or Himalayan roots, or anyone fascinated by ancient DNA and human evolution. And if you have any questions or thoughts, leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.